Spring Boot and Spring Batch, of course, makes batch processing in Java incredibly easy. And for the life of me, I don't know why so many tutorials make it seem so darn hard. I mean, we all know what batch processing is, right? You got a bunch of records. You got to go through those records one record at a time. There's probably some sort of processing or transformation that has to happen. And when you're done, well, you either update the original record or you save that record into a different database or a different file somewhere. The process is relatively straightforward, and the architecture of Spring Batch makes implementing it straightforward as well, and showing you just how easy it is to do batch processing with Spring Boot and Spring Batch is exactly what I put this tutorial together for you. If you give me just a few minutes of your time, I promise I'm going to make you an expert in Spring Boot and Spring Batch, so much so that everyone on your team, when they've got a question about Spring Batch, they're going to be coming to you. And this tutorial is going to start off with a quick discussion of the overall Spring Batch architecture and the different components that we need to create in order to get Spring Batch to work, and that is exactly what we're going to do next. Anyone who watches my tutorials or subscribes to my YouTube channel, and you should subscribe to my YouTube channel, knows that I'm not big on theory. I've always ascribed to that agile tenet of working software over comprehensive documentation. But in this instance, I'm going to make a little bit of an exception, because if you're going to learn about Spring Batch, it's important to understand the scenario or the project that you're going to be using to drive the learning. And also, there's a number of different pieces of the puzzle that you have to put together when you're doing Spring Batch. So I just want to describe what those things are before we jump right into the code. As they say, you never sail a ship without kind of knowing where your final destination is going to be. So it'll be nice to know exactly what we're going to be building here. And what we're going to be building here is a project that deals with this CSV file that just came into my hand. You see, somebody's captured all of the secret text messages between members of the Quebec royal family, and they've given me this massive and salacious file. Now, there's a lot of phone numbers in there. There's a lot of account numbers in there. And before I sell this to TMZ or the Daily Mail, I want to go in and one record at a time, star out any number in the file. That way, I'll be able to violate their privacy without violating their privacy. So that is the essential scenario that we're going to work through here. Now, how do we do it with Spring Boot? Well, first we're going to have to create a Spring Boot project. That just makes sense. Then after we've created the Spring Boot project, what we're going to do is we're going to update the POM file. We're going to include Spring Batch, and we're also going to include a reference to a database. Spring Batch writes metadata to a database as it's doing processing. So it comes as a surprise to some people, but you're going to need to add H2 or hypersonic or MySQL or something like that to support batch processing. Then we're going to create a component that describes what the process is to do for each record. We're going to describe what to do when a string comes in. We're going to take a string, we're going to process it, and then we're going to send that string out. And that's something called an item processor. A string comes in, a string goes out in our scenario, and that's essentially the transformation that happens on each record. Now, if you're going to do a transformation on individual records, well, you have to tell Spring and Spring Boot how to read those records in. Like, does it come from a database? Does it come from a text file? Does it come from a list in memory? So we're going to have to create a class that's called a reader that reads one record at a time from this CSV file. Now, at the same time, you have to tell Spring how to read data in. You also have to tell it what to do when you're done reading that data, when you're done with the transformation. Where do you send that transformed record? So we have to create a writer as well. Now, after we've created that writer component, we've got the reader component, we've got the item processor that does the transformation, we create a component that pulls all those together, and it's called a step. It's like, what's this step that happens when the batch processing runs? And you can daisy chain multiple steps together, but we're just going to have one in this scenario. Then when you've got your step configured, or multiple steps if it's really complicated, you create something, you describe something called a job. And a job is what happens every time a record comes in, every time something needs to be processed. And that job describes how all of these steps and how the writers and all of these things come together. Potentially, there's even something you configure in one of these jobs about what to do when the job concludes. And once we've got all of that put together, well, then our Spring Batch application is complete and we can run it and bask in the glory of the fruits of our labor. Okay, that's the theory. I told you it'd be quick. The next thing we're going to do is start coding. That is what we're going to do next. Okay, I've got my glasses on, so you know I mean business. Before we start, one thing I wanted to remind you, by the way, sorry about any glare. I got a lot of lights in here. One thing I wanted to suggest as we start this video, I tend to speak very clearly. If you put these videos on 1.5 or even 2x speed, they're often fairly understandable and maybe even more enjoyable. And then if I say something important, you can always rewind, you can always pause, you can slow it down. But just watching YouTube videos in general on 2x speed is just a pro tip that you might find helpful. Now, starting off here, I'm going to create a brand new Spring Starter project. I'm going to call it Batch App. I'm going to have the group ID, artifact ID, com.mcnz.batch, Java 17, packaging a jar file. That all looks good to me. What's important is how you decorate your POM file. Now, of course, we need Spring Batch. I think that goes without saying. What doesn't go without saying is you actually need a reference to a database package. When Spring Batch runs and it goes through 1 million records, it has to keep track of where it is in the process. And it uses some metadata stored in a database to do that. So if you don't have H2 or some sort of configuration to MySQL or Postgres or something like that, your Spring Batch programs aren't going to work, even if they all compile and they all look good. So I'm going to add H2. And I'm a big fan of Spring Boot DevTools, so I'm going to add that in as well. Click Finish, and boom, there we go. Our project is created. Now, what do we actually want to do in this project? What we want to do is we want to go through a set of records in a CSV file, all of the text messages from members of Quebec's royal family, and we want to blank out all of the numbers, anything that might reference an account number or something private. We want to make sure that we protect these people's privacy as we violate their privacy and sell this salacious file to TMZ or the Daily Mail. Okay, it's not that interesting a file, but you can see there's numbers in it and there's text. And what we want to do is we want to blank that information out. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that file. You can get that file from my GitHub account. It's linked in the description of this video here. And I'm just going to paste that right into the resources folder. Now, I'm using a CSV file. It could be a database table, right? It could be anything, but this is the place where I'm going to start off in this example. We have a CSV file. We have items in that CS file. We want to process those items one record at a time. Well, in order to do that with Spring Boot demands that you create something called an item processor and tell Spring Boot how to do that processing. So I'm a person that likes to do what he is told. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to create a new class called the text item processor, right? Because each of those records are supposed to represent text messages. That's why it's text item processor. In this example, I'm going to be using strings. You can actually create your own Java classes or records and structure this in a more mature, more professional way. But I think using strings is a good way just to get started and prove how the whole environment and system works. Now, right now, we do have to implement a special interface. So we have to say this implements the Spring item processor interface. As I said, when you want Spring Batch to process items in a database table, items in a CSV file, you got to implement this item processor interface. And you have to tell Spring what data type is coming in and what data type is going out. Now, we're going to keep it simple here. What's going to come in is a string. The string that comes in is the data from that CSV file. We're then going to process it, and then we're going to spit it out So a string is going to go out. It's the process string with all of the numbers replaced with asterisks, bug splats, blanks. We'll put that into a separate file. And so that is the item processor. Now, I do have a, do you see the red X there? If you see the red X there, you need to get your eyes checked because that is a white X on a red background. But the problem I'm running into right now is that I don't have my imports organized, and I also don't have the requisite methods that need to be implemented. As you can see, it says add unimplemented methods. Once again, I'm someone that does what he's told, so I'm going to add in that process method. And the idea here is a string comes in, that's the row from our CSV file, and then we do something with it. That is the string that goes out. We are not going to leave that null. We are not those types of people. So we're going to take that string that comes in, and I don't know, call that the message that comes in. I'm not going to take the default name. And I'm going to make a masked message out of that. And that's just taking the original message and doing a little regex, replace all. This is about the extent of my regex knowledge, __ D, and double quotes there to end it. And then anything that's a D, which I think means decimal, I'm going to replace that with a bug splat. And that should blank everything out. And of course, we're not going to return null. We're not animals. We're going to return that masked message. Okay, item processor, Spring batch. Data comes in as a string for us. Data goes out. It goes out as a string. That's why it's genericized with those two strings at the top there on the class declaration. By the way, this could be any class. So if you've got a person class, if you've got an account class, you can do processing with that and have your data a bit more structured. We got one record coming in, one record coming out. We're keeping things simple now. I do have a little error there, repaste all. This is one of my biggest pet peeves with Java and Spring. It's not only case sensitive, but it requires you to spell things correctly. And I just find that onerous. I hope they fix that. I hope that I change that. But as for now, just getting that spelled correctly, that tightens it up. And now that we've told Spring what to do when it sees a record, we need to tell it how to get a record and how to push a record out when it's done with it. And that is what we're going to do next. Now, again, I don't like wasting anybody's time. And I got a chunk of code here that has to be written out. And I'm going to cheat. I'm going to do a little bit of copy and pasting. But I think you're going to appreciate that because I don't think you want to sit here and watch me and my fat fingers spell things incorrectly. I'm moseying on over into that batch app application. That was the class file that Spring Boot created for me when it created this application. And I'm going to configure a few beans here. The Spring environment needs a couple of special beans in order for batch to work. As I mentioned, we've already got this class that tells Spring Boot what to do when it gets a record, right? Just replace all the decimals, all the numbers, all the digits with bug splats. But how does it get a record? So you have to go into a Spring configuration file. And by the way, the class that has that Spring Boot application annotation on it, that also includes the @configuration annotation as well. So this is a configuration class. You have to have a configuration class that says you're going to expose a resource that knows how to read data into the batch system. And that's what I have there. Control-Shift-O adds my manners in there and organizes my imports. But essentially what I'm saying here is I'm saying to the Spring Framework, look, I'm going to give you a reader class. I'm going to give you a class that knows how to read data in as you do batching. And the class here is a flat file item reader that looks for a string and brings that string into the system. As you can see, I create a new instance of that flat file item reader that comes from the Spring Framework. You can see it's there in the package on line number 3. And I configure it in a couple of different ways. I say, first of all, there's going to be a file on the class path called data-file.csv. And we've seen that file before, right? There it is over there in that resources folder. Along with that, we are going to give this a name. You can just call it CSV Reader. It needs a name, but it's not going to have any bearing on our application other than if we don't include it, in which case everything will fail if that happens. Now, I have done some sort of non-standard naming there. I've given it keybob case with a dash. I didn't use the standard camel case we use in Java, just to emphasize that that's not referencing a Java class or anything like that. Then what we do is we explain to the Spring framework what to do when it gets this file. And of course, this flat file item reader is supposed to read one line at a time. And so we say on line 18, well, as you open up this file, what we want you to do is just take the current line that you're on and then just send it to that item processor, and just do that for every line in the file. And that's what that line 18 is doing there. So that basically just says to Spring, what I want you to do is open up a CSV file. I want you to go through it one line at a time. Every time you look at a line, I want you to send it over to the item processor. And then when you're done with that, well, I guess you can send the results that come back from the item processor to a writer, which is the next thing that we're going to need. We're going to take the result and we're going to save it into a second CSV file. And that second CSV file is going to be named mask-data.csv. Control-Shift-O in the background there to organize my imports. But what you can see being written here is we're saying, okay, we know how to process each record. We need to tell Spring how to read those records in one record at a time. That's what the flat file item reader does. And then after each record is processed, after that string is returned from the item processor, what do we do with it? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to save it to a file named mask-data.csv, which right now is in that resources folder. You probably want it in the Walmart folder if you're doing, not Walmart, Target folder if you're doing production. But as I said, this is good for our example. And so what do? Well, we use that flat file item writer class. We give it a name. Again, it doesn't map to anything in your Java code specifically. What we do is we create that file system resource that points to that mask-data.csv file. So you can see line 31 is referencing the string on line 28. We're saying, I want you to open up that file and write to it. And what we're going to write into it? Well, this flat file item writer, you see it's parameterized with a string. That's the string that comes back from the text item processor. That's the string with all of the numbers blanked out in it. What we want to do is we want to take that whole string and just push that right into that mask-data.csv file. So that is what the writer does. So now we've got a situation where we have told Spring Boot and Spring Batch how to process each item. It says, hey, how do you get the item? Well, we say, look, to read the item, one record at a time, you go to that flat file item reader, and then when you're done processing each record, each row, each item, go to the flat file item writer, read from datafile.csv and write to mask-data.csv. That is the yin and yang of a batch. Now we're not done, but we're done for now, seeing how we can configure this into a step that Spring Batch can use. That is what we're going to do next. The basic elements of Spring Batch is a reader that reads records one at a time, an item processor that does some sort of transformation on that data, and then a writer that writes the results somewhere. In Spring Boot, in order to get Spring Batch to work, you have to create these things called jobs, which are an organization of readers and writers all together. I've got some code here which I'm going to paste in because I don't think you want me to fat finger this and spend the next 20 minutes correcting it. Control-Shift-O does the civilized thing for organizing imports, and all those little red squiggles go away. And you can see this method here. You can see on line 41, it returns a step object. The method is called masking step. It's the step that reads a record, masks the data, and writes it out. And you can actually see on lines 46, 47, and 48, this thing called a step builder, which is created on line 44, uses the reader that we just created. It uses the processor we just created, and it uses the writer we just created. If you don't believe me, just look at lines 42 and 43 there. What we're passing into this method is a flat file item reader the flat file item writer, and the text item processor that we've all declared and configured as beans in this piece of code right here. Maybe I'll even scroll up so you can see them, right? Just in case you don't believe me. And so when you actually specify to Spring Boot how to organize the readers, the writers, and processors, the thing that you use is a step object. And in this method on line 44, we create a step by using this step builder. A couple of other things to note here. You'll notice that a job repository gets passed in. If you're using Spring Batch and you've used the Spring Batch starter, that job repository can get automatically wired into any of your bean classes, which is exactly what happens right here. And that job repository is going to keep track of where we are in the processing when this job runs, when these steps happen. It's going to keep track of how many files we've gone through, what file we need to do next, all of that information. The other thing that gets passed in is a transaction manager, platform transaction manager. And what that transaction manager does is it makes sure that records are processed. After they're processed, they're written out to the appropriate location. And when they are written out to the appropriate location, transaction commits, and we can write into our log files, into the metadata that's stored in that external database that Spring Batch uses, that in fact those records were successfully processed. And then we know that we can move on to the next record if perhaps the process breaks down or we need to start it up a little bit later. So those are a couple of things that come to us from the Spring framework. You'll also notice on line 45, you'll notice that we're chunking out the processing 2 records at a time. What's actually going to happen here when our code runs, when our batch process runs, is we're not going to read a record, write a record, and then do a transaction. What we're going to do is we're going to read a record, read another record, write another record, and then commit the transaction. That allows fewer transactions to happen. It allows more processing to happen all at once. And so the ability to chunk out your processing, like we see on line 45, is one of the special features of using step-based batch processing. And there's a couple of other alternatives that Spring Boot provides. I've got a couple of tutorials on those as well. But this is the standard one that people most use because you do have that ability to chunk out the processing and make things a little bit more efficient. So that's a step. When you create an actual job, so this is one step that can happen. And our process only has one step. I don't want to complicate this thing with 100 steps. It would be foolhardy. But of course, you could have multiple steps in batch processing happen. You would just define the reader, the writer, and what happens. And then you define a job. And in that job, you define the steps. Control-Shift-O. I want the Spring Framework job right there. Make sure you bring in the correct one. And so you can see here, now this particular configuration that returns a bean object is returning a job. The batch environment needs to understand what a job is. It needs to know what to do when it hits a given record. And you can see here what we do is we create a job using the job builder. Okay, we use the job repository. It's going to help keep track of all of the jobs. And we say when this job starts, we want that masking step to occur. And notice that masking step is that first step in the processing. We want that masking step to occur. Now you notice there's other methods here. So there's like next step. And so you could say, hey, I created this other step that does some other processing that needs to get done as well. And so you can daisy chain these together, as the kids say. We've only got one step here, so we don't have to get crazy like that. But essentially, that is it. You create an item processor. Okay. How do we actually process this item when a record comes in? Then you come over here and you describe how to actually read in the records. You have to have an item reader. You have to figure out how to write a record. You've got an item writer. You've got a step that brings all of those together, 48, 49, and 50. What's the reader? What's the processor? What's the writer? And how should we chunk this out to make it more efficient? And then finally, if you've got multiple steps, well, you can link those together in something called a job, or you can have just one step that happens when it starts. That's what this bean configuration here that says, hey, I've got a job that I want to run. That is what Spring Batch is going to look for. When Spring Batch runs, it's going to look for the job to run, and it's the code in there that's going to happen and do all of the processing. Now, we're done. I could probably just finish this video here, right? Stop, tell you, like, subscribe. That's it. We don't even need to test this, right? we don't need to prove that this is working. Again, you should like and subscribe. I would appreciate it. But I'm from Missouri. I need to see how this works. Somebody's got to show me. So I'm going to right click on my application and say run as a Spring Boot app. And before I do, I'm going to go to the text item processor. And I'm going to throw that component annotation on there. I almost forgot. Of course, if we want to be able to use this text item processor over here in this Spring Boot application and wire it in to methods like this, we have to have that at component annotation on it, or configure it in that method itself. Okay. I didn't forget, but I almost forgot. Okay, so here we go. Right click, run as a Java application. It thinks about it. It looks at it. Says, which application do we want to run? And it's the batch app application. I click OK. I see that Spring banner. I see some output. I see some Zaxxer. I see nothing. I don't get any output. I don't get anything. What did I do wrong? Why is there no output? I'm a horrible instructor, right? Click, let's click refresh, and boom, all of a sudden right there, masked data. Do we want to take a look at that? Right click, open with, I'm happy just looking at a little text editor, and the phone number is bug splat, bug splat, bug splat. My account ID is, the AWS key is. Everything worked. Everything was successful. Everything was processed one item at a time. I didn't get any output there because, well, I didn't do any print lines in my code. I didn't want to waste your time with system.out. I just wanted you to be able to look and see what happens in that processor. I wanted you to look and see what happens in that batch application code where we read the record, where we write the record, where we do the step and pull the processor, reader, and writer together, and then we have that job. Let's take a look at that mass data. Let's take a look at that Excel file. Let's put them together, and you can see this is definitely working. Now, there is one last thing I want to show you, and that is a special listener that you can configure to let you know that everything was done successfully. Don't go away, because that is what we're going to do next. No Spring Batch tutorial would be complete without demonstrating the job execution listener. And this is just a very simple class that you can add to any of your projects. And you really should, because when your batch processing finishes, you probably need to write somewhere or send an email or do a message or just do some sort of logging that says the job completed. So I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call it the batch job completed listener, because it's going to listen to see if the batch job was completed. And it's got one friendly little interface that it has to implement. It has to implement the job execution listener. Boy, execution sounds so violent, doesn't it? Sounds very French Middle Ages. Okay, that is the job execution listener. Now, one of the things that you can do here is you can add this method, and I'm just going to paste it in because you don't want to see my fat fingers typing it all in one line at a time. But what you can do here is you can get the status of a job. So you can say, hey, if the status of this job is completed, then you notice that there's a couple of other statuses that you can look for: abandoned, failed, starting, stopped, unknown. Unknown's not very helpful, but I guess you got to have it in there. And after the job has finished, after it's executed, what you can do is you can do some sort of processing. So here, all I do is I take a look for the masked data CSV file. And with that masked data CSV file, I just go through it one line at a time. And for each record in there, I just do a system.out.println. And if there's an error, I just print out the error. But essentially, when the job's done, I'm going to find that masked data file and print it out. Now, just looking at that code, I think I might be in a world of hurt, because that file location might not be found if I just do that. So maybe I need to do string file path equals that, because that's actually where the file is. And hopefully that will show me the data. So I'm going to delete that masked data file, close that, and delete it from here. I am going to make sure that the batch completed listener is saved. I'm going to make sure that the component, because we do know Cameron McKenzie has a habit of forgetting that component annotation. I'm going to make sure that component annotation is added on there. And then finally, I need to give instructions to my environment to actually go in and run that. So I have to go over to my job, and I have to say, when this job runs, I want to add a listener. So you can see right there, there's the opportunity to add a job execution listener. I know of one. I'll call it the, what name should I give it? I'll call it the job completed resource. Now, it's saying, hey, there's nothing called job completed here. And, you know, it's right, there isn't. But since it's got that component annotation on it, it can be injected into this method. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to inject it into this method, give it the name job completed, make sure that the syntax is correct. And now when this application runs, when it completes, what it's going to do is it's going to run this code. It's going to run the code for the job completed resource, the batch job completed listener. That's the one that I've just written right here. And that's going to print out all the information from that masked data.csv file. So again, there's the job execution listener. And that is the method that returns the job object to Spring Batch, saying, hey, line 59, when things complete, call that job completed listener. Okay, Control S, right click, run as a Java application. Everything runs, and look at that. We end up getting the output printed out right there to the console. Our job executioner is working, our Spring data is working, our Spring batch is working, our Spring boot is working, and this has made doing batch processing incredibly easy. Hope you learned something here. If you did, follow, subscribe, give a thumbs up, be nice to your parents, do all of those good things. Until next time.